Good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas, and I'm the president of the SSA New South Wales branch. And on behalf of the branch, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And of course, I would like to say something about the wonderful thing about joining this SSA society. We're always trying to provide more benefit to members. And if you're students, joining society only costs $20, but there are a lot of benefits for you to enjoy, such as discounted workshops. And we're going to run a student mixer very soon. And if you're a student member, then you are almost free to join us. We also offer top-up scholarships and also fellowship top-up, or fellowship contribution grants, if you're one of our members as well. And we'll begin the formal part of the evening with acknowledgement of the country. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to traditional owners of the land on which we met, I think the Gadigal people or the Eora Nation. I should share our knowledge, teaching, learning, respect, practice within this university, but we will also pay respect to knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of the country. And this is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Reidar Lystad. Reidar is a research fellow at the Australian Institute of Health Innovation. It's a newly formed faculty, recently enough, Faculty of Medicine, Health and Human Sciences at Macquarie University. He's an injury epidemiologist with a particular interest in sport injury, traumatic brain injury, pediatric trauma, and combat sports. Okay.
Very relevant to this.
Very relevant. Okay. Very relevant to tonight's talk. And his research is centered around conducting large population-based cohort studies using data linkage of administrative data collection to investigate health outcomes following injury and to guide improvement in health service delivery and health policy. And tonight, the speaker will take us on a whirlwind tour of mortality and survival in Games of Thrones. And please join us and welcome our speaker, Reidar, tonight.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Thomas. Do you want me to dim the lights or?
It's totally up to you.
Might show the slides a little bit better. Yep. Okay, I'll put it back if you like. If you think that's better, I'll leave the lights on so we don't get any injuries here. Right, so confession up front, I'm not a statistician. As Thomas mentioned, I'm just an epidemiologist, so please don't hold that against me. Saying that, I think most of the people in the room probably know a lot more about survival analysis than I do. But I think this talk will be quite different from your regular lecture series. And I kind of like deliberately designed it to be a little bit different, a little bit lighthearted and relatively non-technical because I'm not a statistician. Right, so let's get started. Thomas has already given my background, so I probably don't need to repeat any of that. And we'll just move straight on to this. So this is why I was invited to give this talk, is because we published this paper back in 2018, just before Christmas. So I'll talk a little bit about how it came about, the whole idea of it, what we actually did to produce the paper, and then what sort of impact it has had, both in terms of intended consequences and unintended consequences. So I'll touch on both of those aspects. First, a little bit background. So Game of Thrones probably don't need very much of an introduction. Is there anyone here that haven't seen Game of Thrones or heard about Game of Thrones? All right, a few. So I'll say a couple of words about Game of Thrones. It is a fantasy drama television series that's adapted from a series of fantasy novels written by George R.R. Martin called A Song of Ice and Fire, very popular book series. The TV show is probably one of the most popular TV shows created to date, with hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide. And it has won a record 59 Emmy Awards during its existence. So it's very ingrained in popular culture, put it that way. Frequent media attention received around this show. Just to orientate you about the world of Game of Thrones, this is a map just showing you essentially what that world looks like. Most of the action that occurs in Game of Thrones occurs in this region here called Westeros, and a fair bit in Essos as well, but most of the action is sort of around in this region here. Now, according to the creator of the show, George R.R. Martin, the world of Game of Thrones is, at least in part, inspired heavily by events unfolding in medieval Europe, so around the 1500s, predominantly in the UK, but across the European continent. And essentially the storyline is centered around the ceaseless feuding between various houses or lordships, and they're all sort of trying to gain the control of what is known as the Iron Throne, or essentially just the domination of the Westeros part of the Game of Thrones world. It's also important to note that Game of Thrones is renowned for its frequent violence and its very graphic portrayal of the death of the characters. And during the series, there was a lot of speculation around who would survive, who would die, and who would essentially end up on that Iron Throne at the end of the day. So that was sort of like a little bit of the background. And to me, as an injury epidemiologist, I found all of that quite intriguing. And with the prospect of having to wait around 1.5 years between the end of season 7 and the beginning of the final season 8, I just had to come up with something to satisfy my own curiosity during that intervening time. Another piece of background information is that some medical journals have a well-established tradition of publishing what is known as a Christmas issue. And probably the most famous of those is the British Medical Journal and their Christmas issue. And essentially, the Christmas issue typically features somewhat quirky, light-hearted research papers, but they all adhere to the same high standard in terms of scientific methodology and rigor in terms of producing those research papers. So I thought it might be a good opportunity to write a paper in the Christmas issue tradition, sort of like applying the standard epidemiological methods to sort of like examine the mortality and survival in the Game of Thrones universe. So that's sort of how the idea came about. So the next thing I did was pitch that idea to one of my former colleagues, Dr. Ben Brown, also here at Macquarie University, and see if he would be willing to help me out with the data collection side of things for the project. Now, Ben is a huge Game of Thrones fan, so it was not very difficult to persuade him to be part of this project, put it that way. So back around March, April, May in 2018, Ben and I set out to rewatch all 67 episodes in the first 7 seasons of Game of Thrones. A total of 57 hours and 23 minutes, not including the credits, the opening and closing credits of the show. So the aims of that research project that emerged was essentially to examine mortality and survival in the Game of Thrones universe. And the specific objectives were essentially to quantify and describe the causes and the circumstances of death, and to estimate the survival times and probabilities of the characters in the Game of Thrones universe, and to see if we could identify some of the predictive factors. And at the back of our minds, we're sort of like trying to think about what would happen in season 8, essentially. A quick slide on just the overall methods of the study. The study population was all important characters, and by important characters, for us, to make it manageable, we essentially defined important characters as anyone that appeared on screen, not as part of a flashback or a sort of like a historical event, but during the events of the show. And they had to also appear, the name has to appear in the opening or closing credits of the show. We made a few exceptions to that basic rule, and that was for characters that sort of like had a very integral part in a particular scene. So, you know, essentially if they were murdering someone or being murdered, like murdering an essential character in the show or something like that, we also included them in those particular cases. And only human characters. So there are a couple of fantastical creatures in the Game of Thrones universe. So we didn't include those, we only included human characters. Our data sources was the DVD box set, which Ben had, so that was very convenient. So we could do this relatively on the cheap. We did supplement the information we extracted from rewatching the show with a little bit of information from the Game of Thrones wiki page. So it's sort of like a fan-produced wiki page that has a lot of information about the show. So we could cross-reference a little bit with our own data extraction through there, and a little bit of sort of like metadata around the length of the show and stuff like that from the Internet Movie Database. And that was essentially the idea. It was sort of like to double check a little bit of our own data extraction, essentially. So the type of data that we extracted were social demographic information from the important characters. So that were things like sex, socioeconomic status, occupation, religious affiliation, what sort of allegiance they had in relation to those major houses or lordships that were feuding in the show. And we also created a metric around how prominently a character featured in the show. I must say that, you know, that creating that prominence metric is, it's a little bit, it wasn't meant to be very definitive, but it was just trying to essentially account a little bit for the difference in terms of how much different characters featured in the show. So the metric was essentially just taking the number of appearances or the number of episodes a character appeared in, dividing it by the number of episodes they could have appeared in, and multiplying by the number of seasons the character featured in. So it's just a sort of like a rough estimate of how prominent those characters were in the show. And then we measured a lot of timestamps. So we were sitting there, not with a stopwatch, because we could just pause and play on the recordings, to essentially capture the timestamps for when a character first appeared and when they experienced the event, i.e. death, or when they were censored at the end of the show. So that's essentially the data that we extracted. And in terms of the events, the deaths, we tried to extract a little bit of information around trying to code it, the cause of death and the circumstances of death, using the ICD-10-AM coding classification, which is what is commonly used here in Australia around health-related data like hospital records and stuff like that. All admissions are coded using this coding standard. Right, and then in terms of the data analysis, we used relatively stock standard survival analysis methods, which included some descriptives, and then the Kaplan-Meier estimations and Cox proportional hazards regression, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Now, I'm conscious of the audience I'm talking to, so I probably don't need to go into great detail about time to event analysis or survival analysis, but I'll just say a few things just for completeness sake. And it's a relatively non-technical quick run through time to event analysis. The first thing to note is that time to event analysis is called many different things in different fields. So in medicine, where I tend to work, we call it survival analysis, but in economics, it's typically referred to as duration analysis. In sociology, it's event history analysis. And in engineering, I think it's typically referred to as reliability analysis. So same thing, same concept, many different names depending on the discipline. And this analysis technique sort of was mainly developed back in the 70s and 80s, and obviously with the more sophisticated additions to the basic time to event analysis have been sort of like added on in later years. Oh, not working. Oh yeah. Right, so why do time to event analysis? The traditional approach to analyzing this sort of data pre the 70s were kind of like using standard or traditional methods to essentially just compare the proportions of people experiencing the event, or separately to that, comparing the mean time to that particular event of interest. So separate analysis for two separate aspects of the data, essentially. And this approach had a few issues, which I'm sure you're well aware of. First of all, it's heavily dependent on the duration of the study period. And just to take a little hypothetical example, if we had two groups trying to just look at the effectiveness of the intervention of a new drug for cancer patients, looking at mortality over a 5-year period, hypothetically, we could have the same proportion of deaths during that study period in the two different groups, using the one analysis method. Using the other method, we could potentially discover that the mean survival time is a lot shorter in one group compared to the other. But if you extended the study period, you might get totally different results. So in this hypothetical example, if you follow them for 10 years instead of 5 years, you might find there's a clinically meaningful difference in terms of the proportions experiencing the event, and you might have changes to the mean survival time as well. So that's the sort of like the underlying problem prior to using or the development of time to event analysis. So the question is really how to best handle patients that don't experience the event prior to the end of the study period. That's essentially what the problem boils down to. And there was a couple of different ways you can deal with that. Either you can just treat them all as missing, which would bias the results in a certain direction, or you can set all of those that didn't experience the event by the end of the study period as experiencing the event, which would bias the result in the other direction. So neither of those solutions are particularly satisfactory. And we already talked about the possibility of extending the study period to solve the problem, but that doesn't really work either. Possibly because it's not feasible to extend the study period in many cases. You don't have the resources to do a 30-year study as opposed to a 2-year study. And even if you do extend the study period, you may still end up with biased results regardless. So that's the underlying problem. So the benefits of doing a time to event analysis is that it's capable of handling those events the censored events, the participants that don't experience the event before the end of the study period. And it combines both the event data and the time to the event data. So you have more statistical information in the analysis, which means you also have greater statistical power when running the analysis. The other benefit is that you can run time to event analysis on a range of different study designs. So data obtained from retrospective studies, which I often use in terms of accessing hospital data, emergency department presentation data, and those sorts of things. But you can also use it on cross-sectional data, as long as you capture the essential elements that you need for the analysis, which is whether or not the event occurred and how long it took before the event happened. The other benefit is that it's nice to display survival analysis or time to event analysis information graphically. And we'll see some examples from this Game of Thrones studies very shortly. Right, so the key terms is event or the event of interest. So in this Game of Thrones context, obviously the event of interest is death, but it can be many other things in different in other studies. And then time or survival time in this particular case. So that's the duration from first observing the participant to the end of the study period. And then we have censoring, which is when the observation or the participant do not experience the event during the study period. We have censoring at the end of the study period. Let's get back to Game of Thrones. All right, so just to illustrate what the data looks like for this particular study, we got 7 seasons of TV show. So just to give you a couple of examples, here you got Jon Snow, Tywin Lannister, and Daenerys, Stormborn or Targaryen. So they all appeared in season 1, episode 1, relatively early on. Jon Snow a little bit before Tyrion, and Tyrion a little bit before Daenerys. And they all survived to the bitter end. Or to the end of season 7, I should say, not the bitter end, but I shouldn't give away any spoilers for those that haven't seen it. Right, so that's pretty straightforward. Next one, we got Tywin Lannister, which is Tyrion's father. So he appeared a little bit later in season 1, I think it was in episode 5. And he didn't make it, he only made it until the end of season 4, when he was ignominiously shot with a crossbow by Tyrion while he was on the toilet. Right, next one, we got Stannis Baratheon. He was introduced a little bit later, and then he was killed off at the end of season 5 in the season finale in that show. Lastly, we got Brienne of Tarth. She was introduced again a little bit later in season 2, and she survived to the very end as well. So, and you know, you go on and do this for each and every character, and you get a little data set that looks essentially a little bit like that. You take the start and end time. Yes, spoiler alert. You take the start and end time, and then you calculate the actual time to event. So this is what the like the translated data set looks like in concept. Right, so the components then of the typical time to event analysis is essentially to generate these life tables, which are tabulated probabilities of whether or not a character survives beyond a certain specified time point. These tables are typically quite long, cumbersome, and often not reported directly in the papers because the same information can be produced in these Kaplan-Meier estimates and graphically displayed in survival curves instead. And then if you have multiple groups, you can compare them using the log rank test. And there are many additional variants of both the Kaplan-Meier estimator and the log rank test for different variants of time to event data when needed. And then finally, you have Cox proportional hazards regression, which essentially estimates the baseline hazard function, which is the risk of an event occurring per unit time change with baseline levels of the various covariates you have in the data set. And it also estimates the effects of those covariates on that hazard function. Right. Let's get back to the study and our findings. So we had 330 important characters included in the study, sorry. Out of those, 186 ended up dead before the end of season 7. So that's 56% dead before the end of season 7. In terms of descriptives, cause of death, the major cause of death was injury. In particular, wounds to the head and neck was particularly prevalent. And that also included 13 traumatic amputations at the neck level, otherwise known as decapitations, very famously occurring at the end of season 1 when Ned Stark was decapitated. In terms of circumstances of death, most of them were assaults, as you can imagine. So this slide essentially speaks to the violence of the show, I think. And the second most common circumstance of death was operations of war. And as I mentioned, there were quite a few legal executions, including decapitations occurring. In terms of the survival analysis, so the survival time itself ranged from a mere 11 seconds up to a bit more than 57 hours. So a huge spread in terms of the survival times of the characters. And the median survival time was just short of, I think, 29 hours or so. The probability of dying within the first hour after appearing on the screen was 14%. So a lot of people just pop up and pop away. We looked at the a couple of predictor variables in terms of the social demographics that I mentioned earlier. So these are the Kaplan-Meier curves by sex and social status. And you can see there's a fair bit of difference between females and males, and so-called highborn and lowborn, which is the social status in this universe. Using the Kaplan-Meier estimator and the log rank test, there were quite significant differences between the groups in both of these variables. However, I should probably point out that there's quite some issues with violations of the proportional hazard assumption underlying this, which is pretty obvious from the social status one, where the curves are actually crossing each other. Similar story for the two other predictor variables that we looked at. So one of them was whether or not a character had switched allegiance from one major house to another during the show. And we found that if they switched allegiance, they were more likely to survive, a lot more likely to survive. So being a traitor, as some journalists have phrased it, was a good thing, apparently. And then this prominence variable that I talked a little bit about earlier, you can see there's a little bit of the spread there between how prominently a character featured in the show as well. So you essentially were better off being a highly prominent character in the show than just being sort of like average prominent in the show. So lastly, we have our Cox regression. So the forest plot showing the output from this. Just briefly, for the Cox regression, we did use sort of like a forward selection procedure where we essentially had univariable models for each of the predictor variables. And For the ones that had a p-value that was less than 0.1, we included them in the Cox model. As mentioned before, the last three of these variables had quite some issues with violations of the Cox proportional hazard assumption. So to try and deal a little bit with that, we added time varying covariates to the model, essentially interaction terms for each of those variables with the time that were introduced into the show, which marginally improved the model. So the findings, as you can sort of see, relatively straightforward from the forest plot, is when accounting for all the variables at the same time, sex and social status were no longer that important. And the most important contributing factors to survival were whether or not someone switched allegiance and how prominently they featured in the show. So if we take those findings at face value, we suggested essentially that these three characters had the highest probability of surviving beyond the end of season 7. And as it turned out, all three did survive at the end of season 8, spoiler alert, which is good news for us, I guess. But I should say that there wasn't that much difference in survival probability between these three and the next tier of characters that in terms of survival probabilities derived from the model. So that's the findings of the research in a nutshell, pretty straightforward. Next, I'll digress a little bit and talk about what happened after we published. I'll talk a little bit about the intended and unintended consequences of venturing into this interesting research space. So the first thing is the media interest that this paper received when it was published. Now, we did anticipate that the topic would be of interest because the media was essentially publishing stories about Game of Thrones on a weekly basis. A lot of speculation about who would live and who would die in the forthcoming 8th season and final season. But we were quite overwhelmed by the onslaught, no pun intended, of media interest that we actually did receive. So I'll just quickly go through a few examples of that. We did a small handful of interviews before the paper were published because the media team of the publisher, as well as our own media liaison within the institute here at Macquarie University, both prepared media releases that were sent out to their networks prior to publication, saying that this was coming up. And we did receive a few interested media outlets that were interested in writing stories on that. So we did a few of them up front. And then as soon as the paper was published, we received a lot more requests for interviews and comments and various different things. And then it sort of like snowballed from there. And the stories kept spreading from one newspaper, picked up by another and another and another. And after about, we tracked around 700 stories in online news media. Then we sort of gave up. It was taking too much time to try and track it. But we did take note that it did appear in some of the major newspaper publications around the world. Excellent coverage here in Australia, in Germany, really big coverage in Italy with one of the leading papers over there, coverage in Norway, in India, in Pakistan, in Latin America, and essentially all over the place. But personally, I was particularly pleased that we ended up in BuzzFeed and the Rolling Stone magazine. So there were two personal favorites there, alongside this one. And GQ magazine did a really nice story. And the thing I liked about this was the subheading, which is "You're doing God's work, gents," which I thought was quite hilarious that they would put in there. In addition to the traditional print and online news and media, we did some live broadcasting. So we did 2 interviews for ABC Radio, for the breakfast show in Melbourne and for the Drive program in Newcastle. We got a request from Cheddar Big News in the US, which is sort of like a young up and coming news broadcaster, which is not a traditional one, but just leveraging all the streaming services. So this only goes out to things like Hulu, Amazon Prime, and those sorts of outlets, and not the traditional cable networks. The unfortunate thing about that Cheddar interview was I was getting quite sore. A sore throat and was coughing constantly throughout it, which was not great, but anyway, it is what it is. Social media was a buzz with the paper. I think we ended up with somewhere in the vicinity of 2,500 tweets, generating about 12.5 million impressions, which means that stories about this paper appeared in the Twitter feeds of 12.5 million people or users, Twitter users, which is quite amazing. Now the thing is that Twitter, these tweets are picked up through altmetric, and altmetric only captures the tweets that link directly to the published paper, either on the publisher's website, the Medline version, the PubMed version, or their DOI link to the paper. So these are tweets that only include those direct links, not those other additional comments and whatever. But the coverage was great, as you can see, all around the world, in particular in North America and Europe, but excellent coverage in Africa as well, which is amazing. Some examples, mostly positive. There were a couple of negative tweets, which were interesting, mainly picking issues with particular elements of the show rather than the research, and the spoiler alert kind of angle was featured among the negative tweets, but the vast overwhelming majority were quite positive and thought it was an amazing, fun and awesome idea, which we obviously agree with. There were quite a few academics that tweeted, which I thought was really nice, and most of them expressed the sentiment that they just didn't come up with the idea themselves. They were a bit disappointed in themselves, which I take as a compliment as well. Our publisher, Springer Nature, was very, very supportive and did a series of tweets over the days, weeks and months following publication. So that was great. That created a lot of extra traffic. And to my big surprise, QI, the UK television show, used to feature Stephen Fry. It's sort of like a comedy talk show in the UK, picked up the research and tweeted about it, which I thought was just fantastic. And the most hilarious thing was not the tweet itself, but one of the comments by the Bear Nut, who managed to express this sentiment, which I thought was just hilarious. For those that are familiar with the events of the show, Theon Greyjoy had a particular injury, which I won't go into details here, but that comment is particularly relevant to that particular injury. I'll let you watch the show if you want to find out more. So I mentioned altmetric, which is this sort of service that tries to capture the amount of social media attention research papers get online. And as you can see here, it only picks up a fraction of those newspaper articles. And it's because a lot of the newspaper articles don't provide that link to the published paper or the PubMed or the DOI that I mentioned before. And same with regards to the tweets themselves. But the score, well above 2,700, which is just amazing. To put that in context, all my other research papers that are published range between 0 and 50, if I'm lucky. Right, so this is quite an outlier when it comes to online media attention. It is the most, it's the paper that has attracted the most online attention of all the papers published by this particular journal. And it is ranked #1 at Macquarie with a first author from Macquarie in terms of online attention as well, at least up until last year. I don't know if there's been anything other published since then, which is quite amazing stats. Now, all of that media attention didn't happen by accident. So there was a little bit of planning involved behind the scenes. So I'll just quickly tell you about our media research outreach workflow for this particular paper. So planning up front, we got the publisher's media team involved. We had the media liaison at AIHI at Macquarie Uni. We reached out to the MQ media team as well. They were like, no, I don't think this was interesting. So they stepped back from it for whatever reason. So we said, well, fine, we'll just do our own thing. But anyway, that's their loss. Then we started creating content. So drafting the media releases, we created an infographic to go with the tweets and whatever. We had a video abstract created, which I'll show you in a second. And then we wrote a few lay summaries, including a blog post for on the publisher's website as well, so on the Springer Nature Network. So all that happened before publication, and then tapping into the distribution lists for the publisher's media team and the internal AIHI media liaison distribution list. So I pushed it out to both of the networks. And in addition to that, I had a few personal journalist contacts at the Sydney Morning Herald and the Guardian and a few other places more locally that I reached out to as well and offered them you know, the story essentially. So that was all good. And then the paper was published, and then it's all about trying to handle the responses that we get back. And the good thing is we could do some of those pre-publication media interviews, which was great. And then you just try to deal with the post-publication requests as best as you can, essentially. So there was some happened in the middle of the night, and some happened late in the early in the morning, and it was at any time. If you want to do media, you just got to make yourself available. That's the short end of that. And then we tried to track it as best as we could, mainly through the Altmetric, but the publisher has their own tracking system, and they provided us with a report at the end of the day as well. And then we received a lot of emails just popping up in the inbox as well. So I'll mention a few of those. But this, I think, if it works, should be the video abstract. Do we have sound? Oh, we don't have sound. Let me go back. What do we need to do to get sound?
Noise, is the sound coming off from the laptop? think the people online can hear it, so if as long as your laptop can broadcast, it should be fine.
Haven't started yet. Let's try now.
Fans of the popular HBO television series Game of Thrones know not to get attached to their favourite characters. Why? Because they're likely to die or get killed off. Researchers at Macquarie University analysed 330 important characters appearing in seasons 1 to 7. Their socio-demographics were mapped, and the circumstances and time to death were recorded. Of the 330 characters, 186 had died by the end of the study, proving that the chance of surviving Westeros was slim. All but 2 of the deaths were caused by injury, burns, or poisoning, and the majority were due to assault or war. The survival time of characters ranged from 11 seconds to 57 hours. Analysis showed the probability of dying within the first hour after appearing to be 14%. The median survival time was estimated to be 28 hours and 48 minutes. The characters with the best survival probability were high-born females who had switched allegiance during the show.
All right, so that animation was created by a company called Science Animated, which interestingly enough reached out to us after publication and offered to create a video without cost because we didn't have any funding to pay for it. But they saw it as mutually beneficial to them as sort of like a showcase for what they can do. It was a relatively new startup at that time. I think they only had created like 10 animations up before that time. I haven't checked how many they made now, but they made heaps. So that was very nice, and that added to our media outreach. Leaving the media side behind, I think what we're most pleased about is probably this number here, and this number is the number of people that have accessed the paper through the publisher's website. So that doesn't include accesses through other repositories like ResearchGate and stuff like that. There's several thousand that have accessed the paper through those pathways as well. But for us, this is probably the most rewarding thing, knowing that we've been able to communicate our key messages. Yes, about Game of Thrones, but the key messages about violence and violence prevention that we have slipped into the paper to a really large audience. Lastly, I'll touch on some of the unintended consequences. So the media was kind of intended, although we didn't expect the amount of it. But unintended consequences are things like being here today, invited to give this talk, is something that we didn't plan to do when we set out to do this research. And we've received several other invitations to give talks as well. The first one we got was this one. And it took less than 24 hours before the organizer of this zombie apocalypse medicine meeting reached out by email to invite me over to the US to give a talk about what we were doing in terms of the Game of Thrones paper. Now, I was a little bit skeptical when I saw that email, but the SAM, the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting, is a legitimate thing. It's a very niche kind of discipline. It's sort of like in good spirit, but it's a conglomeration of multidisciplinary researchers. So it's not just a medicine thing. It includes sociologists and historians and a few other things. And they're using the zombie apocalypse as sort of like a lens to view existential threats to humanity, essentially, and come up with creative and innovative solutions to those things. So that's one thing I've learned, is that there is such a thing as the zombie apocalypse medicine meeting, which is quite fabulous, I think. We did a talk at Venture Cafe, which is just down Waterloo Road. Venture Cafe is sort of like an international thing, but the Sydney branch of it is sort of like affiliated with Macquarie University. So it's a nice little bit of public outreach. We did a talk for the Encourage, which is the ECR network for the Faculty of Medicine. So we were invited to give a talk at their annual retreat. That talk was sort of like more about the science communication aspect of it, although we did get to talk a little bit about the Game of Thrones specific stuff as well. As I mentioned, lots of emails have come through our inbox. They mainly fall into 3 categories. One is just friendly emails saying that thank you for doing this. I had a really enjoyable time reading it, which is great. We love to hear that sort of stuff. The second category is requests to use the paper for teaching purposes. And that's something that we never thought about up front, but has dawned on us afterwards. That's like, yeah, of course, this is a great, potentially a great teaching resource. So we received quite a few emails like this one. So this is a professor of science communication in Spain reaching out saying the paper was nice. Please, can I use it for my own teaching purposes in science communication? Received similar emails from Norway, want to use it to help the students improve their scientific writing. So it's a model paper for scientific writing and those sorts of things. I came across this on Twitter. Apparently someone put it in their final exam over in the US somewhere. I don't know which university it was. Don't know what kind of course it was, but assuming it's a more like epidemiology, biostatistics course of some sort, or research methodology, I'm not sure. But it's been used a lot for teaching purposes. We got a request from the author of this book, which is frequently used in the biology discipline. So the new edition, the 3rd edition, includes a chapter on survival analysis, which features data examples from our Game of Thrones research, which is very nice. The third category of emails were data requests, and they started to just roll in one after the other. People from Denmark, people from Oxford in the UK, people from Germany, people from the US, and the list just went on and on and on. We tried to sort of like deal with it on an ad hoc basis. It didn't work, so we created sort of like a data sharing policy and agreement, so like a standard contract kind of stuff that we pushed out. And then the requests were just too many. It was just taking too long to handle it. So we gave up on all that and just published the data set on Figshare. So now it's freely available to anyone. You can just jump on Figshare, download it, and it's free to use for educational purposes. Well, I assume that's what most people would use it for, but if you want to use it for something else, you're free to do that too. I should say the Figshare version is an updated version. It includes season 8 data as well. So it's a little bit different from the published version in the paper. Now, I just want to finish with this brief slide, I think, which is essentially just why would I bother studying mortality and survival in Game of Thrones in the first place? So for me, it was essentially an opportunity to demonstrate that science doesn't have to be boring, and maybe try to increase the appreciation of science in the general public a little bit, like a very lofty, general, high-level goal, I guess. More specifically, it was an opportunity to showcase a particular scientific method, so survival analysis, and increase the appreciation and understanding of that in the public sphere was really important to me, and so like increase the profile of the discipline of epidemiology, I guess. I guess COVID had completely superseded that aspect. I think epidemiology is probably one of the sexiest disciplines out there at the moment due to COVID, which is nice for the discipline, not so nice for the world, but anyway. And the third reason was an opportunity to talk about violence and talk about violence prevention. And as I said, we embedded some really good key messages around those topics in the paper that I hope that a lot of the people that downloaded the paper have actually read and taken notice of. So I think TV shows like Game of Thrones can sort of help remind us of our own violent past in terms of humanity's violent past, but also remind us how much violence has declined over time. So there's a really positive side message there, that things are a hell of a lot better now than they used to be when it comes to violence. And I think it's a good opportunity for us to reflect on why that has happened, and what have been the contributing factors to that tremendous decline in violence. So in the paper we refer a lot to Steve Pinker's book about why violence has declined. So I would really encourage anyone interested in that topic and want to know more to pick up that book. It's a tremendous read. It's a bit of a tome to get through. It's very data heavy, but it's a really, really good read. So on that note, thank you for your attention.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Let's see whether there's any questions in the chat. All right. It's an excellent talk, guys. Any questions from the audience? Oh, Doug.
Yeah, great talk. Can you get a feeling of the media that picked it up? How many made a hash of explaining it?
So hang on, before I go respond, I just want to rephrase the question to the online audience. Sure. The question is about whether the media actually make a mess about interpreting the output of the paper.
It's a really pertinent question to be asking, so thank you for that. The first thing to say about media is they do what they want. And you can try and control it, but you can't. There's things you can do in terms of being really good at framing your key messages and stuff like that. And we try to do that to the best of our ability, although it was a bit of a baptism by fire in terms of handling media. I must say handling media in this context has been a lot easier than it has been for a lot of the other real research work that we're doing, because it was all done in really good, lighthearted spirit. So it was non-confrontational type of media interviews, which was good. In terms of how they related the findings, highly variable. Some were good. Some interviews were really engaging. Some even engaging in the methods side of things, surprisingly enough. Very interested in how that kind of worked. But a lot of them were interested in just the general findings, which were good, and some of the key messages. Not everyone picked up on the violence prevention message that we tried to get in there. Some of them just left it with the violence, but you do as much as you can.
There's some questions in the chat about how to handle the resurrections of certain characters.
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned this earlier on. So it's a really good question. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to that. Tricky. We had a couple of options. So we were considering to include, and it's not just Jon Snow, by the way, there are other characters that died and were resurrected, some an unknown number of times, which made it a little like Beric Dondarrion, which made it a little bit tricky, because we initially thought, Jon Snow, okay, died once, resurrected, so we can pop him back in multiple times in the data set and sort of cluster on the individual to try to account for the multiple appearances. thought that would have been sort of like a clever idea to handle it, but it didn't work for other characters like Beric and Darian when we didn't know how many times they died, and we had no idea what the time points were for his other deaths and resurrections. So we just couldn't do it. So we ended up just peeling back and essentially saying, well, they didn't really die. So that's how we handled resurrection in a most simplistic manner that we can think of. And on that note, I probably should add that when we were faced with difficult decisions and assumptions like this one, it wasn't just this one, but like this one, we often erred on the side of making it simple, because the more complicated and tricksy we could have made it, the more would have been lost in terms of that general message and translation afterwards, I think. So we wouldn't try to avoid detracting too much from the main message.
Thank you. I think Hassan has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your report. I like that because of the new direction of research, and also you talk about the story after publication. I like that part as well. My question is about the goodness of it. How do you check the accuracy of your model? For example, you can work with 6 episodes, 6 and then series, and then look at the 7 series that exist at the moment. Check if your model works in prediction or not.
So the question is about goodness of it.
Yeah.
Whether Reidar actually checked the accuracy of the predictions or survival, using currently the released final season.
So with the original paper and the original analysis for the first 7 seasons, we didn't do much of that. Is the short answer to that. We had an opportunity to sort of revisit it in the context of when season 8 was released. We did weekly updates or episode by episode updates of the model that we released on Twitter. And I don't remember all the details of the parameter estimates and all that kind of stuff off the top of my head, but the short of it is the model didn't change much after adding the season 8 data to the model.
Okay, I think we almost run out of time, so we'll take any final questions.
What is next?
Okay, the question is about what's next in this research.
You'll be surprised how many times I've been asked that. I've thought about a lot of different options. First of all, I'd probably leave Game of Thrones, but we could apply different analysis methods to different popular culture aspects. And I thought about some combinations that might be interesting, but every time I sort of like have a lead and it's like, yeah, that might be a good idea. And I think a bit more about it and it's like, maybe not. And so I haven't really come up with a good one yet. I think the most challenging bit to replicate in the context of the Game of Thrones paper is the timing. We were just really fortunate with the timing of it. The idea to do it at the end of season 7, before the final season, was just ideal, I think. And finding another popular culture angle like that would be, depending on timing, I think. So I don't know what's next.
There are suggestions in the online.
Harry Potter.
Yeah, I thought about Harry Potter. Yeah, not quite as violent, that's right. The problem is the timing. Yeah, it's still obviously very popular around the world, but it doesn't have that. What's the media phrase for it? It doesn't have that urgency or immediacy. Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Maybe something before the next Star Wars movie. sure there's going to be another one.
The Mandalorian series is certainly picking up some traction. So yeah, maybe.
All right, I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you everyone for joining us in person today, and also those that are joining online. Hopefully everyone has a wonderful time, learn about survival in Games of Thrones, and please join us to thank the speaker once again for a wonderful talk.